Hello, and thank you for joining our panel discussion on children's grief and the importance of supporting grieving children. I'm Nichole Stangle, the Bereavement Coordinator for Children's Wisconsin. The bereavement program here at Children's provides a wide variety of grief services and programming to bereaved families to facilitate and support healthy grief. Today, I'm joined with four of my peers from different organizations throughout the state of Wisconsin who work with grieving children and their families in dealing with and managing grief. They are Erin Hollister, Center for Grieving Children, the Boys and Girls Club of Fox Valley, Michelle Miller, Unity Hospice, Melissa Minkley, Healing Hearts of Waukesha County, and Deb Monasterio, Kyle's Corner in partnership with Children's Wisconsin. To give you some perspective, in Wisconsin alone, 1 in 15 children will experience the death of a parent or sibling by the time they are 18. That means there are approximately over 80,000 grieving children and teens around Wisconsin at this very moment. And those numbers don't even reflect the youth grieving the death of a grandparent, an aunt, an uncle, another significant relative, or a friend. The number of bereaved children and teens in southeastern Wisconsin and Menominee County exceed the national average. Let's start our discussion with the basics. What is grief? And when a child is grieving, what does that look like? Deb, could you help us out with that question?
Yes, thank you. First, I'd like to start out by saying that grief is unique to everyone, and so it will not look the same for each person or child. It really is a unique experience, very much like a fingerprint. But what we can kind of prepare ourselves for, especially with young children, is to see pretty much of a roller coaster of emotions, and that can happen in a very short amount of time. So a child might be playing just fine, and all of a sudden they have big flashes of emotion, and that could be anger or sadness, as well as a host of other things. So age really can make a difference in what that grief looks like. Some additional common things that we see is that children will often become very clingy. They'll be more anxious and worried and fearful. And oftentimes there can be regression as well. So that might mean baby talking or even bedwetting. Those are all very common impacts of grief.
Thanks, Deb. So understanding that grief is a reaction to loss, a child might experience grief for a multitude of reasons. Could you talk a little bit about that, Michelle?
Yeah, absolutely, Nichole. As we consider the impact of grief, we also want to recognize that not only are children experiencing the grief as a result of the death of their person and the loss of their relationship, but there's also a lot of additional losses that we refer to as secondary losses. So some factors that we might want to consider when we're thinking about a secondary loss, or we might want to think about the relationship that that child had with that person who died and the strength of their connection. Was this a person who was involved with their day-to-day life and helping support them with all the things that go on in a daily routine? Commonly for children, some of these secondary losses just pop up in those daily routines and can be big or small. They might include who's getting them ready for school in the morning, or maybe doing homework after school if it was a grandparent that would pick them up and support them that way. And now that person's no longer there. It's going to look a lot different. Another thing to maybe consider is, depending on the circumstances of the death, a child or a family might be forced to move out of their home, or someone new might be living in the home, perhaps a step sibling or a grandparent. They might need to change schools or even move cities, and all of those changes can certainly lead to additional losses, such as support from families and friends, teachers, organizations, sports, and things they were a part of each day. Another area to consider too is just this idea of family traditions and how special days were spent. Those are going to change and look much different for many of children. I can remember a boy coming to group once and he shared how much he loved planning out his birthday cake each year with his mom. And knowing that she would not be there to help make this extravagant cake each year was a big loss to him. These losses are going to extend into the future as well as we look ahead towards milestones like birthdays, graduations, maybe your first time hunting, learning to drive. All of these are things that your person's not going to be there for and is a loss. All of these can deeply impact a child's ability to feel safe and secure. And we want to recognize that children often have a lack of influence in these decisions that are being made for them. So one way to maybe consider supporting them would be to bring them into those conversations and helping them feel connected and that they have a voice in what's happening for them.
That's an awful lot of changes that children will be going through. Thanks for sharing that. When my two oldest children were only 6 and 4, our cat died, and I remember how devastated they were. I also remember how devastated they were when my parents died and how much they struggled with that. When a death occurs in a family, how can the adults support the children? Erin, could you speak to this for us?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Just as Michelle was mentioning about the loss in different daily routines of not having that caregiver with them still. So a way that we can support the children is to provide that consistency in our routines, like provide them with that structure that they need, the predictability, because when they lose someone they love, they don't have as much predictability. So as much structure and routine that we are able to provide for them. And also, as Michelle alluded to, like providing those opportunities for choices and for the kids to have control. That the locus of control is important when it's when children are grieving the loss, because there's not a lot of control that they have. So also in being able to recognize and help children process through what that death looks like, and that every child grieves differently. And so like for younger children, maybe they need to process that through play and through reading books with them. And for older children, where peers are really a little bit more important and influential to them, how great it can be to be able to connect with others that they can relate to. So offering opportunities for that kind of support, that's the kind of grief work that we all do in peer grief support, and has been very beneficial for many of our families to not feel alone in what they're going through, because many times when children are grieving, they are feeling so alone and isolated. So to know that they have that way of connecting with others that also get it is really important to provide them with that opportunity. And also, when we work with our families and the children, we kind of work through the tasks of Warden's 4 tasks of mourning. So accepting the reality of death. So in supporting our families and children, it's allowing them to have that opportunities to be involved in the funerals, and so that they can have that kind of closure for themselves as well. And then also having the conversations around the death and what that looks like, and being honest and simple language and what they'll be able to understand. And processing the pain of grief is another task that we work with. So again, with being able to allow them to play and work through the emotions and normalizing those emotions and experiences that they have is really important. And then allowing them to adjust to the world without the deceased. And that's, again, with peer support, also expecting grief triggers. They can come up at any time, whether it's at home or at school. So when they have their loved one, when they're at home and looking at a video with their loved one, you just being able to be open and provide. The most important thing that we can do is provide that safe space and to support them in having all of these different feelings that Deb was talking about before. So, and then also last but not least, another task that we work with the families, and it's important in supporting the children, is just to find a way to keep that connected and a continuing bond with their loved one.
Oh, thank you for that, Erin. Melissa, when you're having these conversations that Erin just described, how do you specifically talk about death?
Yes, Erin did a wonderful job kind of giving some suggestions on how to have these difficult conversations. And one thing that I always emphasize is the importance of using the words death. Sometimes we make the mistake of using terms such as they passed on or they're asleep. I remember when I was a child, my mom I overheard my mom talking on the phone, and she told her friend that Sue lost the baby. And of course, I really thought the baby was lost, and I went to go find it. So it's important that we use the term death, and it's okay for children to hear that word. It's actually good for them to hear that word. It helps them, understand the reality of what they're experiencing. One thing that children need the most is reassurance, and we can never give them enough reassurance. And, sometimes they may ask us questions and we may not have the answers to it. So sometimes we're hesitant to encourage them to ask questions because of that fear of, wow, what if I don't know how to answer that question? So I always encourage families, adults, to kind of create those opportunities for children to ask questions. And when we don't have the answers, be okay with that, and even say, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. It's a good question. But maybe we can ask so-and-so, maybe they might know. Not to be hesitant or discourage children asking questions, because they need to do that. They need to explore and gain an understanding of what they're experiencing based on their age appropriateness. And so they're going to guide that for us. Another thing is, not only create those opportunities for children to ask questions and participate in conversations that help them understand what they're experiencing, but welcome it. Give them permission. Anytime is a good time to ask these questions, and I'm always available for you. So those are some things that I think when having those conversations, it's important that we keep those things in mind.
Melissa, when you talk about kind of creating that space, I can imagine that can be pretty scary, though, to talk to your children about death. Deb, I was wondering if you might have some advice on how do we talk to children? How do we be a little bit more confident when we're having that conversation?
Absolutely. And we get calls all the time because it is a very delicate thing. We need to be age appropriate in our response. We don't want to give a child too much information if it's really not necessary. And yet at the same time, we really want to be honest and address those questions. So it is a fine line to walk, and it makes a lot of people very nervous. What do I say? How do I say this? As Melissa already talked about, it's a tough spot to be in, and it can be very scary for the person answering those questions. So we always try to make our families aware that there are lots of resources available that have very gently and tenderly addressed those really difficult questions. And I think one of the things I'd like to stress the most is that it really requires age appropriate responses. So that even means the words we're using need to be understandable. With the child that we're speaking with, we wouldn't want to use words that they don't understand. We don't want to take things for granted that they do understand. So it's really important to start at that basis of their question. There are lots of book recommendations and videos. Connecting with organizations like the ones we're representing can really make a big difference, because anyone in that organization would know how to help that personal need that that family might have. Because as we talked about before, grief is very much a unique experience, and so the more personalized it can be, the more helpful.
Oh, thank you for that. I imagine when you, as the adult, are grieving as well, it must be difficult to support your children at the same time. Erin, could you speak to this?
Absolutely. So just as a child is grappling and having a really difficult time understanding what it is that about death and now that their person is not here, it is so hard for adults it's to wrap their minds around that. And oftentimes, naturally adults want to put the efforts into making sure the kid's okay and often at their own expense. So then they're not able to take as much time and effectively grieve for themselves. So, and as we all know, the saying, you can't pour from an empty cup. So self-care is really important in taking time for adults to be able to process their own grief. Because as we work through the tasks of mourning with our kids, we're doing the same with our adults. That's why we, in our support groups, we have children groups and then we have adult groups, because the same can be said for supporting our adults as it can be for our children. So not feeling alone in what they're going through. And, being able to surround your kids with other adults that love and care for them so that you can take time for yourself is a really good way to get that space, but then also know that your child's okay and with the people that care about them too. And giving yourself permission to slow down, because our world is expecting them to rebound fast, and it's a pretty fast-paced world that we live in, and our society is not very accepting of what grief really means for adults and for children. So being able to put those boundaries up where you need to with family members and friends, even when it's uncomfortable, your grief is important. Your person that you are missing is important. And all of that is just very need to keep in mind when you're going through this, and giving yourself space to say it's okay to have a day of rest. It's okay to not be okay today. All of those things of giving yourself permission. And I don't think we give ourselves enough of that when we're missing someone that we love. And asking for what you need. I know that when we are missing someone that we love, it's very hard to even know what that looks like. But a lot of people, family and friends, they want to be able to help out in some way because they feel so helpless, and you can't fix grief. Grief is not to be fixed because it's love. It's love of another person. It's love of something that you're missing. So if there's actionable ways that people can support you by taking care of the kids, by doing meals, by offering to mow the lawn, or in our case right now, it's snow, shovel the snow in the driveway. But all those different things add up and really help. So if you're a person that's supporting a loved one in grief, those are some actionable ways that you can support them, and also for the caregiver to feel supported in their grief as well.
I love that you use the word permission. And I have to agree with you when you said that that's awfully hard for adults to do, is to take that permission to do that self-care. Melissa, what is the impact if an adult isn't practicing self-care?
Well, first of all, I too appreciate what Erin said about the importance of adults, parents, attending to our own grief in order to be available to our children. I believe that's one of the number one things, the best way for us to guide a child on their and help them experience their grief is by doing our own grief work. And it is the hardest work we've ever done. So self-care is very important. And when we don't do that, when we don't allow ourselves to attend to our own grief, what happens to our children? Well, some of the research that's coming out through the National Alliance of Grieving Children is showing that what tends to happen is children then tend to act out more. They're much more into feeling insecure and lack of self-esteem, as well as increased anxiety. And so, one of the things that we can do for children is show them what grieving looks like, what healthy grieving looks like, and that's by taking good care of ourselves, by giving ourselves permission to attend to our grief needs by connecting with others who understand and get it and aren't going to encourage you to move quickly through your grief and will allow you to attend to it, as well as communicating what you're thinking, what you're feeling, what you're experiencing, being able to communicate that to your friends and family, as well as other people in the community who can be supportive. Those we call them the people who get it. Surrounding ourselves with people who get it, who can that understand what grief entails and the effort it takes to be able to allow ourselves to mourn our losses. So to me, that's self-care. That's not selfishness. That's about taking care of ourselves. And when we do that, that's how we care for our children.
I really latched onto the word attending, attending to your grief. And that makes me think of, processing our grief. So what are some ways to help a child process their grief or process as a family? Deb, could you speak to this?
Absolutely. When families are kind of searching for things to do, there's going to be a wide range of things that are available, and really not everything is going to fit with every family. And so there might be some ideas that just don't match up with who you are and maybe what your family might need. But some of those wonderful ways of acknowledging that person, of staying connected to that person, is things as simple as having a meal that person loved, maybe on that person's birthday, or it could even be planting trees or flowers, or participating in something that gives back to the community in honor of that loved one. It could be something that people start, a tradition. Every year we're going to do a fundraiser for such and such, because our loved one really supported this organization or really believed in this idea. Those are just some simple ways, and it can even be as simple as going for a hike and talking about that loved one and sharing those stories. So it doesn't have to be big, but what we do want is that it's that opportunity, as Melissa was talking about early, that opportunity to talk about that person and to be able to ask questions and to better know them. And so however the family might decide to do that, that would be the end goal, is to not be afraid of the pain that might come up, because we know that in order to heal, we really have to allow ourselves to feel. And if we try not to do that, then our grief just kind of festers and stays where it is. So so families might have to try some things before they find what really clicks with them. But there's lots of things that can be done.
If I can also
That
add,
was really great information about how to help the grieving child and the family. Michelle, who else should we be communicating with about the death in order to help support the child?
Yeah, Erin, did you want to say something before I talk about that?
if that's okay,
Yeah, absolutely.
I'd love to talk about like with the kids and how they process death and how we can support them in that. So with all the different feelings that Deb was talking about, like it's important to recognize like, so how do we healthily process that with the kids? So one activity that we did at the center is we have anger monsters. So kids got to write down things that they were really angry about, and then they get to tear it up because anger is an actionable feeling. And they got to tear it up and then make their own little grief monster on a bag. And then we filled it with how do you help your grief monster? And so then we put like bubble wrap in it, bubbles, and all different things to help them cope. And then that's also modeling for them and then modeling for each other the different ways that they can take care of themselves when they're so. And journaling for older kids is another really great one for helping them process. So again, with what Deb said, figuring out what works for each child and family is really important.
Oh, that was wonderful. Great examples of how do we support children? How do we support the family? Michelle, who else should we be communicating with about the death in order to help support the child?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, when we're considering who should we communicate with, what should we share, a good place to start is just naming the people that your child spends time with on a regular basis, kind of taking a moment and reflecting on who those people are. You know, we often assume that people have heard about the death, right? Our worlds have been turned upside down. So I think oftentimes we think, oh, well, most people are kind of aware of what we're facing, but that might not be the case. So we want to make sure that we're taking the opportunity to talk to the people like teachers, school counselors, maybe sports coaches, certainly childcare providers if the children are younger and maybe in a daycare situation, doctors, parents of your friends' children, maybe troop leaders or church leaders as well. While it can be overwhelming when we consider having these conversations with people and kind of uncomfortable, remember that you only need to share what you're comfortable sharing. That might look like just sharing who in the child's life has died and what their relationship was to the child, perhaps sharing with them what their connection was like, maybe what the child's understanding of the death is and the circumstances surrounding the death. If there's any sort of behaviors that you might want to watch for, like you know your child struggles when it's time to say goodbye or separate from you. And then certainly ways that you know are helpful to your child to cope and things that help support them. Those can all be really small but helpful things for the other caregivers and other adults in your child's life to help support them. It also helps kind of alleviate some of those awkward situations and then will help the adults feel empowered to support the child too. Lastly, we also want to communicate to the child that we shared this information. We wouldn't want the child to be caught off guard that somebody knows some pretty important parts of their story that they know that they didn't share with the person. And we want to continue to build that trust. So it's really important that they're aware of what we're saying and who we're saying it to.
That was very helpful information. Thank you. And as all of you have been talking, I couldn't help my mind kind of turning to COVID-19, right? Because it has turned our lives upside down. it has had a huge impact, I would imagine, on the grieving family, both the adults and the children. Melissa and Aaron, could you both talk a little bit about COVID-19 and the impact that it's had on families?
Absolutely. It's created a lot of change and forced us to adapt to a lot, from ranging from canceling family vacations to the death of a loved one and not being physically present at the time of death, especially if somebody had desired that. So all those different changes that people are experiencing, all those losses. One thing that the pandemic has done, which I've noticed for myself as well, is it's minimized these losses. I think we've haven't been available to family and friends to be able to support them like we would have been if there wasn't a pandemic. It also kind of we were unsure of how to support each other, not knowing, what is the best approach. And one of the things that I noticed that I was doing with my teenage daughters was I was minimizing their losses. And I was helping them I was coming from an approach where, you know, maybe there'll be more homecoming games, there'll be more proms, there'll be, another family vacation. And, this is the sacrifice we all have to make for the safety of all of us. And so I wasn't really creating the opportunity for them to grieve. And I feel like the pandemic has done that. It's taken away those opportunities for us to mourn together collectively so that we can support each other. And I think that adds to our grief. It makes it a little bit more challenging.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, Melissa. I think a lot of our families that we work with at the center are also newly widowed or have been navigating that for a while. And so then there's also this fear around what's going to happen with my loved one. And so we've had those kind of conversations in our groups and how to support one another with that. And I think any way that, again, it kind of comes to how can we help families feel safe, feel assured that we're there to support them and they're continue to be supported to each other. So continuing to reach out, continuing to provide different opportunities and ways that they can connect, whether it's virtual. And as we know, a lot of our families are also experiencing Zoom fatigue and with school and all different things of how we've had to creatively adapt to the times, but being able to focus on what our families need the most is really important. And the pandemic has also aggravated the impact of racial disparity in our country. And so recognizing that what this means for different people other than ourselves and being aware and compassionate about that. And again, being able to reach out for that in the higher risk of mental health needs because of isolation. I mean, our kids are grieving. And then there's this, and again, grief is isolating itself. And so being able to find ways to connect is incredibly even more important right now in the pandemic.
Thank you both for really kind of highlighting those kind of unique impacts that COVID-19 has had on the grieving process. And before we get to our final point, our final discussion point, I was hoping that one of you would be able to share some ideas on how someone could learn more about the grieving process.
So if you're looking or interested into learning more about grief or supporting grieving children, there are so many opportunities and resources that are available. One of the things you might want to do is just consider how you like to learn. If you're a person who likes to read and books or audiobooks are something that you enjoy, a good place to start would be there. Perhaps looking for books that are about specific losses. They have books, everything from suicide to specifically how to cope with grief, and focusing on those sort of areas. Certainly our websites all have resource lists with books that are for children and for adults. And you can also peruse your library or Amazon. I'm sure we'll turn up some good recommendations as well. Another great way people that seem to be getting information these days is through podcasts. So there are entire podcasts dedicated to providing grief support and education. And a lot of these podcasts are people sharing their own experiences. And those are a really great way to learn about grief and also normalize your grief process. Professional organizations are another great way to look for resources. Melissa had mentioned the National Alliance for Grieving Children, and there's also the Association for Death and Dying. Those are great places to look that have really good theoretically based support and research. They have webinars, continuing ed credits, and lots of free resources available. And certainly you can reach back to any of us. We would love to be of support to you, provide you with education, provide you with resources for your community, your school, families, anything that would be helpful for you as you continue on this journey.
Great resources. Thanks, Michelle. So throughout the years, I have been supporting bereaved families. I have witnessed time and time again, comfort in connecting with others through that shared experience and many powerful moments coming from those connections of healing. One of my favorite programming pieces we do at Children's is our family camp called Camp Oakleaf. The healing we witness in one weekend, it's breathtaking. One 9-year-old told me she loved camp because she healed and sealed a bunch of holes she had in her. Another child drew a picture of himself in the year 2047 as an adult with his Camp Oakleaf t-shirt on because he was coming back to camp as an adult to volunteer because he wanted to give back because he got so much out of camp. And I remember him running excitedly up to his camp facilitator with that picture and telling the facilitator to keep that. I could go on and on. And I was hoping that all of you could share some of your stories of healing in your programs that you've witnessed.
I could go first. We just wrapped up a in-school support group virtually with elementary school, a local elementary school, and one of our kiddos, this is a sweet little boy and so tender. He lost a loved one within like a month of joining the group, so it was quite recent as well. And so at the beginning of our groups, we are always setting up the space for make it safe. So we have, it's okay to have all different feelings. All feelings are welcome. And also it's okay to pass. And for this little boy, he had such a difficult time. And then we also go around in our circle and we say who we're here to remember and our names and a little bit about each of us to kind of get to in the space. And for this little boy, he had such a difficult time even saying his loved one's name without crying and feeling so emotional about having to say that. And so the first 2 sessions, he was kind of a little bit more reserved and he wanted to pass. And then in the 3rd session, all of a sudden, it was like, okay, I'm ready. And he said, I'm here to remember. And then he said it without hesitation, and he was proud of being able to have that moment of adjusting to the loss, adjusting that it's okay that his person died and he's now remembering him in this way. And then towards the end of the groups, He was saying that he was here to remember his loved one, and then he also wanted to remember his friend's loved one, and then also the counselor's pet hamster. So he had so many wonderful little critters and people that he was here to remember, and how wonderful that group experience for him was to be able to process and share in his feelings with others that he can relate to.
That brings to mind a similar experience I had with one of our teens, and I feel like being a teenager is just really tough. And I can remember this young man walking in, and he wouldn't make eye contact with anyone. He literally was looking down at the floor, and even if you asked direct questions, he wouldn't respond. And just you could tell it was kind of just leave me alone. I don't want to be around people, kind of, a persona that you could sense. And this didn't happen the first night, but I do remember later in our sessions watching him come down the stairs, and he was actually talking with another person from his group. And he was looking at that person. You could tell that they were having conversation. You could tell that it was important. And I just felt like, wow, that is what this is all about, is connecting someone, who is about the same age as you are, who is also experiencing a death. And that's pretty unique. It's not normal lunchroom conversation. And so to be given a chance in a safe, warm, inviting place to say the things that you're wondering, or to recognize that the person sitting next to you also experienced something like you did, that's when those feelings become normalized, and they don't feel so alone anymore. And I feel like I get to witness that all the time. But that one young man really stood out because the way he started group, I think it was pretty clear that he didn't think this was gonna be very helpful. And yet he came several times, and whether he realized it or not, he was already starting to kind of open up and be more connected with others. So, and that's the start. That's what we want to help everyone feel, is that they can start to heal.
I'm just loving these stories. There's one that I reflect on often, mainly because it just taught me so much. But there was a young girl that participated in Healing Hearts, and in our 12-week program. And one evening she showed up and she said, "I just love Mondays. I used to hate Mondays, but now I love them." And I said, "Well, why is that?" She goes, "Because I get to end my day at Healing Hearts." And I said, "Well, what's so special about Healing Hearts?" And she said, "Because everybody here is so caring." And at that moment, I just realized we should never underestimate how important it is for us to let a child know we care about them. That goes a long way for these children, and it's such a simple thing that we can do for them.
That's really beautiful, Melissa. Yeah, we don't know what they take away, right? I think in this work, we don't often know what they leave with. So hearing that is so encouraging. I feel like we could do this part all day, but if we have to pick one, every so often, kind of like Deb said, you get to witness these moments where a child or a teen realizes that they're not alone in their grief. And for me, one of those moments was a little guy who was about 5 years old and came to our group for the first time. And we have our opening circle where you go around and you say, your name and who the person was in your life that died. And another child had said that their dad had died. And no sooner had he finished speaking than this new little boy's hand just really shot up in the air. And he just shouted from across the room, "Mine too, my dad died too." And you could just see the relief in his face, and just hear it in his voice that he was not alone, that there were other kids that had had that experience as well. And I think it's such an honor to be able to get to just witness some of these little glimmers of hope and healing that are happening. And that, kind of like Melissa said, we're trusting this process. We're trusting that by showing up and being immediate and being caring and providing a safe place, that these kids are getting what they need to continue through with a healthy grief process.
Those heartwarming stories have just filled my heart, just being able to listen to what you guys experience and what you witness and see with these kids and these families. How wonderful. I want to thank you all for joining this panel, and I want to thank you all for viewing. I encourage you to check out the websites for each of our panelists' organizations listed in the video description to learn more about the important work they do to help our kids. Have a wonderful day.